Hi there, and welcome back to Home Loan Answers. Today, I am so excited to be here with my friend and my personal favorite closing attorney, Bill Byington. Thank you, Bill, for coming in and doing the interview with us.
Glad to do it. I'm excited.
So today, just wanted to talk to Bill a little bit about a few things and pick his brain. Maybe he can answer some questions for you guys if you've got questions about the closing side of mortgage loans and how that works. And so I just wanted to bring Bill in to ask a few questions for that. So Bill, start out, let's talk about what exactly got you into real estate closings and being a real estate closing attorney. How did you work your way into that?
I think I got lucky because when you start out at law school, unlike medical school, when you get out of medical school, you're trained first. Like my daughter is trained to be a radiologist. In law school, you take these general courses and you go to a law firm and they hire you and you fill in a niche. And so I got into doing, when I first started out, I did all sorts of stuff, everything from divorces to criminal trials, when they used to make you do that, the courts did, the young lawyers, and then I also did real estate. And so I really liked the real estate, and I sort of leaned that way, and I liked it just because it fits my personality. You have deadlines and schedules, and I like to stay on track, and it's an organized way to law practice as opposed to when you go to court, they'll schedule you a case and you get ready for a case on Monday and you get there and there'll be other cases ahead of you and say, okay, this one's postponed for a week. And I just like the organization of it, and I like the structure, and I like the meeting people.
So, well, good. So what would you say is the most rewarding part of being a real estate
the
closing
meeting people
attorney?
thing, I really have had so much fun. There have been people I've met and I met a guy this past summer that I did a loan closing with, and I'd never met this guy in my life, and he was in town, and we were talking about he had an Army hat on, and I said, oh, you're in the Army? He said, yeah. And I said, where were you in basic training? He said, Fort Jackson. And I said, well, I was in Fort Jackson. And I said, when were you there? And he told me, and I said, I started there 1 week later. I said, what company are you in? He said, C21, which is and I said, I was in B21. Well, it turned out for 8 weeks we lived within 150 feet of each other. Our barracks backed up to each other. We went to the PX at the same time. We had the same experiences. We did the same trips to the rifle range, and then just interesting things. One fellow I met was, this is about 25 years ago, he was a Japanese prisoner of war camp. And he told me all about his experiences there and how after the war, something I'd never heard, he said when the war was over, they just left the camp and got on a train and just rode around Japan on trains until they finally said, y'all better put out a post, everybody better be back at so-and-so by a certain time. But just interesting things like that. I've met so many interesting people, and I like people. I like the fun of meeting people, and I really enjoy it. I really do. It makes me smile to when I think about all the good times I've had just sitting in this room doing a job that I get paid for.
Right. Well, I can definitely see that because every mortgage closing that I've ever been in with you, you have always been the utmost of energetic and make sure that everybody's involved and everybody feels comfortable. And so I could definitely see that you're a people pleaser and that you enjoy meeting people.
Well, if you can make something fun or make something dull, why not make something fun?
Exactly. Well, let's say from a real estate closing attorney standpoint, what would be your best advice for a first-time home buyer?
Well, there's the thing of anything. Be sure you get what you want. Be sure you're, not more than you want or need or less than you want and need, and you turn around 6 months later and say, holy moly, I wish hadn't done this. But I think the main thing is, from a first-time home buyer, is real estate's the contract, is to be sure what's in that contract, because once that contract is signed, if you don't, usually people have a realtor, and their realtors are going to solve that problem for them and help them, and that's a good thing. But sometimes people will buy something from someone they know or their family knows, and the people will present them with a contract and they sign it, and once it's signed, it's done. And it might have things in there you don't want, or things that you didn't include, or I had one time, this is years ago, these people did that, and they didn't read through the contract, and they put in there that the sellers could dig up all these plants they planted around the house, and the people got ready to move in, and all these azaleas and things were just dug up, and the holes were left in their yard. I mean, that's not a serious thing, but it just was an issue, and just need to be sure that everything is covered. Somebody looks at that contract that's either your realtor, which most people have, or if not, then if somebody presents you the contract and wants you to sign it on the spot, you just need to say, let somebody look at this. I got a friend that wants to look at it, or say, I think I hear my mother calling me and I need to go to the bathroom or something, and take the contract and try to go somewhere and get someone to look at it. They can give you some help because, again, like I say, contract, once it's signed, it's interesting in our business that when you do a refinance on a house, there's a 3-day rescission period where you can change your mind.
Yep, that's exactly right, the 3-day right of rescission.
You got a 3-day right of rescission. You've owned this house for 100 years and you decide you want to borrow $50 on it. You have 3 days to change your mind once you sign the documents. But when you sign a sales contract, it is signed on that minute, and that's what you go with.
That's true. So when you get to the loan closing and you sign your documents, that's it. You're going to get the keys and everything's a done deal there. You don't have time to go back and change your mind after that. And I do think that there are, and what I've seen a lot is that first-time home buyers, it seems like, don't realize that a sales contract is a legal binding sales contract. Mm-hmm. We don't call it, typically you don't hear people calling it a legal binding contract. You just hear people say sales contract, or agreement to purchase contract, but it is a legal binding contract. And I've always advised also clients to know that it's very important to make sure that you read through that document, make sure you understand everything, or that you are working with a good local trusted realtor that should sit down with you and go over the importance of each section of your legal binding contract, including your important dates, because there's a lot of important dates in there as well that are your contingencies that can hang you up if you don't meet certain deadlines within a certain time period. So
that's
I always
exactly
advise
right.
that.
Like, for example, getting out of the house, the seller getting out of the house. And, there'll be some, I had a situation recently where they did their own contract and they didn't put anything in there about the seller getting out, but the lady hadn't lived in the house in several years. She lived with some relatives, but she just, once they closed, she just didn't want to get out of the house. She said, well, I have 30 days, she kept telling people. And there was nothing in there that says that. And this was before, after they signed the contract, we said, you need to resolve this. And the lady said, well, I have 30 days. And they said, well, it's not in the contract, ma'am. Technically, the day of the closing, they can let you out. The buyers were very gracious. They said, we'll give you a couple of weeks to get your stuff out, but we really need to no more than that. And funny story, part of the story is this one lady was 90-ish, and after the closing, a day or two later, the buyers called me and said she came by the house and they had someone looking at the gutters, and she got her a cane and walked up, and the guy was on a ladder, and she whacked him on the leg and told him get away from her house.
Oh no!
So, they called me, and I called the lady's daughter, and she said, I'll take care of it. But the lady just was convinced that they couldn't do anything for 14 days.
So that is a perfect scenario, exactly. And then what a lot of buyers need to realize too, and sellers, that even if the buyer and seller do agree to allow the seller to live in the property after loan closing for a certain amount of period of time, for a certain term or a certain number of days, that your mortgage documents, from the loan standpoint, the mortgage documents you sign basically states that you're going to live in the house within 60 days if you're purchasing the property as your primary residence.
Correct.
So, that's, I always try to tell the realtors, especially the new realtors, that, you can't do that more than 60 days because the mortgage agreement states that the property is going to be occupied by the borrower within 60 days. So, got to look at those dates and keep those dates in mind. So that's something that's very important. So the next thing I wanted to ask you about, Bill, I get asked this quite a bit from borrowers, mm-hmm. and the question that gets asked is when I'm going over the closing costs with them and we get to the owner's title and the lender's title, the questions always come up, and I answer, but I would love to hear your perspective from explaining to us exactly what is owner's title versus lender's title,
okay,
and what's the purpose behind it. What does it cover?
Well, the difference in owner's insurance and lender's insurance is the lender's insurance just covers the loan, and it doesn't give anything to the owner. For example, if a title is something that's determined to be wrong with a title, and you'd be amazed how often things come up. I was on the board of directors of a title insurance company for 5 or 6 years, and we get letters or we get calls in all the time with things which had been missed. The attorney who check the title, they simply miss something, and that happens.
Well, they're human.
They're human. or a problem is something has been misindexed at a courthouse. And now with the it used to be in the old days, and I say the old days, not the 90s and up there, and before everything got so computerized, you would write out a name, and if there was a slight misspelling, it would still be under that alphabetical first couple of letters, like Byington. If they put B-Y-I and then misspelled it after that, then you'd see it, and then you would notice it when you're checking the title. But now, if it's not exactly correct, it doesn't. When you check it by the computer, which is where you check it, it doesn't pop up. And every year, except so far, I'm a few days left in this year, that I've had at least two where I've come to loan closings. And what I do is when I'm going over the closing documents with the seller, and I say, and we're paying off this loan, and I say, and this is the only people you owe, is that correct? And they'll, usually say yes, but every year up until this year, I've had at least twice say, well, no, I owe a loan to so-and-so, which then puts me in a panic, and I'll get up and run back there and I'll check, and I've done that, and I look under their name, and it's, I don't see it in the online service we pay for. And I'll come back, and then like one time I did something like that, and one of my law partners said, I told him the name, it's like McKenzie or something. Well, he spelled it the way differently than the way he thought it should be as opposed to the way it was, and there it was. Oh. And it was indexed incorrectly at a courthouse.
Gotcha.
In a surrounding county here, and so that's the problem. So in that situation, let's say you've got a loan that's sticking out there, and these people, if you had not been caught, then the buyer would be there, and the bank would be coming to them that the seller owed the money to, saying, "Hey, I want my money." Well, owner's insurance. I guess a simple example would be, let's just use $300,000 as a purchase price, and you get a loan for $200,000. If something is really wrong with the title and you're going to lose it, well, the owner's insurance would cover the entire amount, would reimburse the person for their money, $300,000. If you just have lender's insurance, it just reimburses the loan, and the guy's out the difference between the $200,000 and the $300,000. It's sort of like, I guess if you had a simpler way to put it is like if you have insurance on your house and you insure it for $200,000, but the house is really worth $300,000 and it burns down, they're only going to pay you what you insure it for, and that's what the lender gets. You pay off the lender with the lender's insurance, but if there's more value there and there's a title problem, then you're out. And if you've paid a bunch of money up front,
you really need
the owner. I mean, I buy property, as you know, investment property, and I get title insurance and I do the legal work. So I just want to be careful. We had something. I've had this within the last 6 months. A title insurance company called me and was asking me a question about, would I have caught this? Could I have caught this? And it was a situation where the lady had died and she'd had two families. Oh. But the first family, the one child was sort of estranged and wasn't in the picture exactly. And the two children from the second marriage were her, in their minds, the only children, even though technically they're not. So they got together, they went to court, they filed for permission to sell the property, and they got the court documents saying that they were the heirs and they were to get the money. Well, they didn't list this other person. Oh. And this other person somehow found out about it and came back in and, was making a claim saying that I'm owed, again, let's use 300, 200. Y'all got 300,000 for this, 100 of it should be mine. And the title insurance company called me and said, was this the lawyer's fault? I said, there's no way they could have known.
Right.
These two people went to the court, presented the documents, but yet that didn't mean that third party did not have a valid claim for her third. So that's where the title insurance could come in and help out in a situation like that.
And help cover that.
Right.
Well, and I personally advise all clients to get both, you have to have lender's title to cover the loan.
Right.
I always advise that you get owner's title to cover yourself as well. Every loan I've ever had, I've always gotten it. Simply because, and that's been some loans I've had large down payments and some I have not, but regardless, I get it. I've always felt like it was one of those things that if you ever needed it and you didn't have it, it would be one of the biggest regrets of your life.
Any kind of insurance, so any kind of insurance, people say, well, it's, but if you don't have it and something goes wrong or something comes up and you just can't ever tell, or that you might have to pay someone for that they have an easement through your property. That's some easements are and you want them to get rid of it, but that's not as great an example as I guess the fact with the one with the missing the heir. But there can be things. It's simply, again, it's back to sometimes lawyers just simply miss something.
Right.
And we know that, and we know that's one of the things that will protect the person.
Right.
And I always go over it with at the closings. If they say they don't want owner's insurance, I point out to them, I want you to sign a form saying I'm telling you you should get it, and if you don't want it, that's fine. But I just want to advise you so that you won't come back to me later and say, well, you should have told me that.
Right. And that's actually one of the things I was going to mention is that from the lending side, we also have a form that we have them sign that states that they knowingly understand that they're waiving that owner's title insurance if they want to do that, because you don't want them in the near future to come back and there be liability.
Right.
So you want to be able to prove that. So I know that comes from both sides. So there's actually two documents. You're catching them from your side to cover yourself, and then the lender's going to catch them on this side to cover themselves as well.
Well, when something goes wrong, I mean, it's human nature. People are looking for somebody to blame other than themselves.
Yeah, and I've heard some pretty crazy stories when things do go wrong. So it's always one of those things you're better to have it.
Well, I had something, a fellow not so long ago, this is about 5-6 years ago, though, he bought a house from his brother. And his brother sort of neglected to tell him he had a $48,000 federal tax lien against him.
Oh, my.
And he sold the property. Once it's transferred to you, it's your property.
Right.
He paid his brother whatever he paid him, and then the IRS came looking to the new buyer, the brother, and said, hey, where's my money? And this guy didn't have title insurance, of course, to cover him. And so he ended up paying his brother for the house, and then his brother did not do the right thing, and he had to pay his brother's IRS lien off, or else the IRS was going to sell his house at the courthouse.
So is it true what I've heard that if you have a mortgage lien, let's say we close a loan today and it's January 1st, the lien's going to be recorded at the courthouse and it'll be dated January. But is it true what I hear that if there's a federal tax lien that the government actually has the right to go supersede, as in go and put themselves in first lien position before
if the seller, if there was a federal lien on the seller, yes.
Yes.
In other words, like if I'm selling you property and the IRS has got a lien on me for taxes, and I sell the property to you, that lien follows the property is the exclusion. And a lot of people will ask them about payoffs or stuff like that. But any lien, if you have a overdue library card and the library puts a lien on record, and then you try to sell property, that any kind of lien attaches to you as a seller. Doesn't matter that it's not for the property. Doesn't matter what it's for, how it came to be. If somebody has sued you and you owe them money for a health club bill, for anything, then it goes on your property. Any lien of any kind that's a judgment in a court attaches to the real estate and, as we say, follows the real estate.
Gotcha. Another good reason to have owners and the lenders' titles insurance.
That's right. That will cover you.
So when we get to let's say when we go to the closing table, borrowers have to obviously bring funds to closing to be able to finalize the purchase of their new homes. So is there any advice that you have as to what they need to bring, like from a closing standpoint or a title company standpoint? What do you guys expect in the way of borrowers bringing their funds to the closing table the day of closing?
Well, what has happened, and I can't remember, it was during the recession. There was a law firm in Atlanta, and one of the lawyers was not doing what he should have been doing with some of the money. Let's put it that way. And I think he had a condo in Vegas and he had a plane or something. Anyway, there was some money, and some monies went missing and was being misappropriated. So the legislature stepped in, and before they had not, that was up to the individual attorneys and the lenders as to how to handle that. But the state of Georgia stepped in, and they have passed a law that if you have to come up with more than $5,000 at closing. Let's say you're buying the property, it's $75,000, and you're only borrowing $60,000, so you got to come up with $15,000. You're supposed to show up at the closing, but over $5,000, you're supposed to have the money wired in to the law firm, not a cashier's check. The cashier's check, they don't, because there are so many fraudulent cashier's checks going around. If it's $5,000 or under, you can do a cashier's check or whatever if the lawyer wants to take a personal check. But the Bar Association has put on us that we're supposed to, over $5,000 is supposed to be wired to us, so the what is called good money.
Gotcha.
And that the funds would then there'll be no question that it's not going to be, when we transfer it to the seller, so that they can then maybe use it to buy a new house, or use it for whatever. Then this buyer could have stopped payment on it or given us a fraudulent cashier's check. I learned a lot in the last 10 or 15 years about fraudulent cashier's checks. I did not know that they could be done, but I just happened to be in line at a local bank here in town, and I was like the fourth person back, and I heard some discussion up front, and the teller said, "Bill, can you step up here?" And this lady was depositing a cashier's check she had gotten for like $25,000, but she was supposed to then wire these people $5,000 back of it. And the lady said, "This just looks funny." And so we got on the phone. It was a bank in Canada, and we called the bank, and they said, "Yes, somebody has run off and forged or faked a bunch of cashier's checks on our bank," and said, "No, this is a fraud." And this poor lady, was about to wire them $5,000 out of her account. So the law is, it's not it's not, and I'll be honest with you, sometimes, if it's somebody in town and it's local, a local person I know, when they bring me in a cashier's check for $10,000, and I'll take it. I probably shouldn't admit that, but if it's somebody under those circumstances, I will. But the law in the state of Georgia is over $5,000, the money's supposed to be wired to me.
Okay.
Anything over that, I'm taking a risk on that person. In other words, like if that were to go kaflooey, it's on me.
Gotcha.
And then that extra $5,000, I'd have to write a personal check for to cover it.
Gotcha. And then one of the other things I think we've talked about too is that there's also a scam going around where there's wire fraud. You have to be careful about wire fraud. So with my borrowers, and any good lender would, usually what I try to do is I try to copy an email with my borrower and your paralegal on an email where she can directly send those wire transfer instructions directly to the customer, so that it's not coming from me, because it could be that it could have changed or it could be changed. And so I try to always send that joint email and then ask the paralegal to go ahead and send that over to the borrower, so they have those wiring instructions directly from your paralegal.
That is so smart. And some of the time, I'll tell you, some of the banks that we deal with, out-of-town banks that do, it's about the only time we still use our fax machines now, is the...
Don't you remember when it was the best thing?
I know.
Better than sliced bread.
Yes. The greatest invention ever. But when we'll call about a payoff, and they're worried about being hacked, and they will fax us the payoff and all the payoff information because you can't hack the fax. And there's a local lawyer here in town who had that. He got caught in a wire thing like that, and somebody hacked the lender or hacked somebody, and then sent him new wiring instruction. He wired the money to them, and it was a fake. And so that's why everybody's very cautious about that now. And it's smart to try to have some triple and double checks, and some way to be sure you don't get caught up in something like that, because that's not good.
Exactly. Especially not even realizing it. It could happen.
I know, and
that's the scary
it gets
part.
gone. And once it's gone, it's in hyperspace, and they just can't run it down very
on the other side of the world.
Yes, on the other side of the world.
It's scary. So yeah, always be due diligent. Make sure that as far as wiring your funds, make sure that your lender is getting you in touch with your closing attorney or the title company and getting those wiring instructions sent over directly to you. That's what they should be doing. And so then that leads me to my next question. So what if we have a borrower who can't come to the closing on closing day? What do we do in a situation where maybe we have someone that's going to be out of town the day that their contract says they have to close on the loan?
Well, most of the times, the simple way is to get a power of attorney for them, to get them to sign in advance, saying that someone can stand in for them and sign the documents. That is and that happens some of the time, and sometimes things are unavoidable. And so the power of attorneys work great. We have to have an original power of attorney, and we have to record it with the documents, and we can do that, and they can do that now. The problem, of course, occurs like during COVID. During COVID, we had a tent set up in front of our office here, and we were out in the parking lot. Instead of having anybody come to the office, we had auction tents set up from an auction company. Dempsey Auction Company here in town let us set their tents up out there because they couldn't use them. So they said it was good advertising for them being right on Broad Street where we are. And they're very gracious, and it helped us, and they said it helped them. But we would have somebody might get diagnosed that morning.
Oh.
And that's when you got a problem, is that if you've got somebody who all of a sudden gets ill the day of a closing, that's hard to work around, and we have to come up with something. Sometimes they're incapable to get in, and at that time, sometimes they'll call us, and we'll try to whip them up a quick power of attorney. Somebody might could take it to them, and they bring it back to us, and assuming the mortgage companies approve, they're okay with it. Mm-hmm. And most of them all are. I had one mortgage company one time that I can think of several years ago, and I remember the gentleman is a husband and wife, but he was in the service station in England. And so we had a power of attorney for him, but they would not let it be used. They said that they wanted him to, and so we had to postpone the loan. There's nothing we could do about it. But
so he was in the service in England?
In service.
Might have been a VA. That might have been a VA stipulation with VA, but I know we've used power of attorneys for VA also before, so I'm not sure.
I'm not either, but that's the only time I really had an issue about that they just said, well, he just, you can go over to England, which I would have gladly have done, but it just, anyway, we had to wait. He was coming home in about a month, so they just delayed everything. But sometimes that happens if a buyer, you just can't, the day of the closing, can't make it. And again, if you know in advance, it's not that big a deal.
Right.
Not that big a deal.
And if the borrower doesn't have someone local that can stand in for them, then I know sometimes we do what's called a mail away.
We do the mail-aways. And those are more difficult only because if something goes, you mail the documents away for them to sign at if they're out of town, but then if something changes, then you've got a problem because you can't get it in time for the closing. I mean, let's say it closes on Thursday, and Monday you get the documents, you overnight them to them, or you email them to sign, and they send it, and then on Wednesday all of a sudden something changes. Well, those Monday documents for the Thursday closing are no good, and so the power of attorney, we will let somebody, we don't like to do this, but we'll let somebody, if they're okay and they want somebody in our office to do it as their power of attorney, to accommodate them and make the loan work, which is our goal is to make the loan close.
Absolutely.
That's when I get in this here, when people go, people say, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if people get arguing with each other? I say, my job is to not take sides in the argument necessarily. My job is to see the loan closes. And if they walk out of here not caring so much for each other, that's okay if their loan closes, because the seller wants to sell and a buyer wants to buy. They don't necessarily have to be warm and fuzzy if things go that way, but it rarely happens. Occasionally it does, but occasionally have those closings where the buyers will say, I'm going to be in this room and I want the sellers in this room and I don't want to see their faces. And happens.
We've done that before too, haven't we?
We have done that too. And that happens, but it's really rare, and usually it's a pretty pleasant situation.
Right.
But occasionally you've got those things going on.
Well, you've always made the loan closings as pleasant as possible. I've always enjoyed it. So yeah. So and then you might want to keep in mind for our borrowers out there, or listeners, that if the closing actually has to be postponed for some reason, if let's say it is the day of closing and you come up with the flu and you can't make it, and if you've got the flu, please tell us. We want to know that.
Yes. We do want to know that.
If you have the flu the day of and for some reason you just absolutely cannot make it, then one thing to keep in mind is most all real estate contracts have a time period that the loan contract the loan closing can be extended. So in some contracts it's built in there that there's a certain amount of days that either buyer or seller could postpone the closing or move the closing back if need be. And we've done that too if we've had to accommodate someone, and I know Bill's always been very gracious to do that for us as well. So, Bill, that pretty much wraps up all the questions I wanted to ask as far as loan terminology and processes. So I just had one last thing I wanted to ask you, and that was without mentioning any names to protect the innocents, can you give us just the funniest or the most bizarre loan closing that you can that comes to the top of your mind or that you've ever sat through?
Well, I've got three that I think about of all times. One was a big business sale where, again, without mentioning any names, the seller was very annoyed with the buyers and let them know he had a pistol in his sock. And that was sort of interesting. And but it, that was, I always remember that one. That was bad. And then a second one I think about was we had a closing. And in the closing, you usually are asked for your copy of your driver's licenses. And this was when we'd first started doing this 15 or 20 years ago. And I'd asked these people for a copy of their driver's license. And the gentleman was here with his wife, we thought. And he said, "Bill, can I see you outside?" So we stepped outside, and he said, "Bill, that's not my wife," because the title's in both their names. Like in my case, Bill Byington and Janet Byington. But he said, "That's not my wife." And I said, "Well, what's the deal?" He said, "Well, I really want to buy a bass boat." And I said, "I'm not following you." He said, "Well, we've got a bunch of rental properties, and this was one of them." And he said, "I want a new bass boat, and my wife says I can't have one unless we can pay cash for it. So we've got these rental, she doesn't know how many we have, but she's on title because I wanted her on all of them. So I can sell this one house. This is just a friend of mine who's pretending to be my wife. We sell the house, and I'll have money, and I can buy my bass boat." And I said, and she'd already signed the documents, most of them by then. And so I called the realtors out, and I said, "Tell them what you told me." And I always think the funny part of it was he told them, and they're looking at him with their jaws, like, and I am too. And he looks at all through and said, "Now this isn't going to be a problem, is it?" And we said, "Yeah."
Well, of course not. Why would it be?
Yeah. So we had to come up, and then the fellow said, "I said, well, and the buyer, this is a first-time home buyer. And the realtor for the buyer said, this will scare them to death." And I said, "Just tell you what we'll do. I'll just say it's all my fault. I did everything wrong. I did everything wrong. I messed up. Everybody's got to come back tomorrow. And then and I said, and you bring your wife back tomorrow." And I told the realtors, the realtor for the buyer said, "See when your folks can come." They came out and said, "Okay, they can be back tomorrow at 10 a.m. And the seller said, "Okay, my wife and I'll be here at 10 a.m. And I said, "No, you won't." I said, "If you show up here tomorrow with somebody different that's your wife, what are they going to think?" He said, "Oh, I didn't even think of that." And I thought, that's not the first thing you didn't.
That is a good one.
That's not the first thing you didn't think of. But I guess the one that I think is the granddaddy of them all, I felt so sorry for everybody. And I felt sorry for this lady, and everybody in my office said, "Well, why are you feeling sorry for her?" But the bottom line is, there's a form, the name affidavit form. Mm-hmm. And there's a form like if you maybe your credit's listed in a different way. My name is William W. Byington Jr., but they might have it as Bill Byington. They might have it as William Byington. They might have the junior off. And there's a form when they check your credit, and you sign saying, "I am these people."
Your AKAs.
Your AKAs, your alias form.
Right.
Well, the gentleman was sitting to my left here, and they just talked about they'd moved to town. They'd been married 2 months. The wife was sitting the next chair over, right over there. And so I passed his form to him to sign. It just said, Bill Byington, William Byington. And I just passed her form past him. And this gentleman grabs this form and starts looking at it. And he starts looking at it and looking at it. And he puts it down. And I don't know really what's going on. And I looked toward the wife, and all of a sudden she goes, and I'm thinking, uh-oh, because there's a lot of different last names on there. And they go outside and come back in about 15 minutes later, and she's been crying. And this gentleman is so mad. His face is as white as my shirt. He stands there, and the sellers are over here. And I remember because they had their van parked across the street. They were moving back to Ohio. And they said, "What's going on?" I said, "I don't know. I think it's got something to do with this name affidavit." And he comes back in and looks at the realtors and the lender. The seller does, stands right up by this table. She sits down again, she's all crying. He says, "I am going through this purchase." And he looks around the table at everybody and says, "I don't want one person at this table to say another word till it's over." And he points to me too. So I don't. I just pass the documents around and we all sign it. We get it all done. I go get the money and I come back in and I've got the checks cut and I'm handing them out to the realtors and all. And the fellow says, "I assume we're finished?" And I say, "Yes, sir." He pushes that chair back, walks out there, and leaves her sitting. And I think he thought he was lovely husband 2 to 3, and I think he was lovely husband in the 5 or 6 range.
Oh.
and he found out at the closing table. So that was, and of course, and so this lady sits there, and we're still too nervous to say anything. The sellers don't say anything; they're afraid to speak. And she gets up about, again, 30 seconds later and takes a deep sigh, walks out that door, and when we hear the front door shut, it was everybody explodes. and it's sort of like what you went back to earlier about when the deal is done, the seller says, "Is this done? Can he come back and undo it?" And I said, "No, sir, I've got the money. It's closed. It's done. It's signed. Here's the money. He left the table. It's over. He can't undo what is done." But that will be the one that will always stick with me as the most unusual closing that I have. I really hope I don't top that. I don't want to top that. I do not want
I would hope not. I would hope not.
I don't even come close to that.
That is probably one of the most bizarre I have ever heard.
Never in my life, and I've told that before to people, and people have come in here and told me things like that. So I heard about that closing you had with a lady who had been married 6 times, and the husband thought he was number 3. They'd only been married 2 months. I do remember that about them, and I had no idea their names. So somebody said, "Do you know what happened to them?" What came up? I said, "I had no idea. I don't remember their names." I mean, I was so traumatized by the entire event, and again, as the ladies here in the office said, "You're feeling sorry for the wrong person." I felt sorry for, but I feel sorry for everybody.
Yeah.
It was a bad situation.
It's just a bad circumstance.
Made for a good story.
Absolutely, but I sure wouldn't want to be a fly on the wall that night at their house.
No. So, but it's been a fun career for me. Like I say, I'm so glad I got into this as opposed to the stuff I used to do. I enjoy meeting stories like that, and these things like back here on the wall. Couple of these. I'm a history buff, and some of these y'all might not can see this, but there's some. My mother-in-law died, and she saved the newspapers from when World War II started, the day Pearl Harbor was bombed, and there's one behind me of the day World War II was over. But then I did a closing several years ago, and a gentleman called me. I never met him. Called me several months later, and said, "Bill, my mom died, and she has these old newspapers." And he brought in on the end there's the Kennedy assassination, and over here, what you can't see is a man lands on the moon. All the Rome News versions of it. So.
Yes.
And that's been the pleasure of doing this, is meeting people like that you get to enjoy. And I've met people who, a fellow last 2 weeks ago who we just had a good time at closing, called me to go to lunch this week. So, I like that interaction, and it's been a great career for me doing this as opposed to going to court and having people argue about shower curtains in a divorce. So.
Well, I am just absolutely thrilled and was introduced to you from Jack Nedrak.
Yes.
And I am so glad that Jack introduced us. You have just become one of my all-time favorite attorneys, but definitely one of my very favorite friends as well.
Thank you.
You are a very good friend to me, Bill, and I appreciate it very much.
So I really appreciate it.
And thank you for taking the time today to do this interview with me.
Well, this was fun.
I enjoyed it. I had a great time. So, guys, you heard it. That was our interview today with Bill Byington here at Cox, Byington, Twyman, Johnson.
Well, Johnson left. My son-in-law left.
Oh, that's right. He's a judge now.
I don't know what this says about me, but I've had 4 of my law partners leave me to become judges here in our county. I don't know if it's me. I don't know. I don't take it as a good sign, but maybe it's a bad sign. Who wants to work with Bill? They'd rather be a judge.
You've been a judge before too, though, right?
Yes, I was a judge too. I had a spell there for about 12 years where I was a judge. And I like this a lot better.
Do you?
I do. I really do. Everybody likes different things, but I like this being more than the judge part.
Yeah, I enjoy this part. I love real estate. To me, it's very rewarding.
Mm-hmm.
When you finally get that customer and they finally get those keys and
you
they're
see the
so
happiness
excited.
on their face.
Yes.
You see the happiness on this face.
Yes.
It's very. I had a good friend. They had this thing they're doing in town for a while, or they still do it, but they changed it. They were voting on best lawyers. The Rome newspaper did this. In a couple of years, I had won it, and a good friend of mine finished second a couple of years. But he does domestic work and stuff like that. And he said, "Bill, you should have to beat me 2-1 because when I do a divorce, half the people hate me." He said, "The other side hates me. When you do a loan closing, you have 2 sides, and they both end up liking you. So they both vote for you." I said, "You're right. I should have to beat you 2-1 to get this award." So, but it's been a great career for me, and one that's brought me a lot of pleasure. And like I say, I enjoy it. That's why I'm still working. If you'd asked me 20 years ago would I still be working at my age, I'd say there's no way in this world I'm going to be working at this age. But I like it too much I've cut back to 4 days a week, but I like it. I just like being here with the people and meeting them.
I do too. I enjoy the people as well. And the people enjoy being around you as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. So now we are Cox, Byington, Twyman.
Just Twyman.
Gotcha.
Cox, Byington, Twyman. We also have Caleb Ratliff, who does a lot of real estate here, and we have some other lawyers, West Evans and Lee Treadaway, but you know, the real estate guys are Ray Cox, me, and Caleb Ratliff.
That's right.
So,
well, you guys do a great job for us, and we're gratefully appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You guys have a great day.
Bye-bye.